Imagine President Donald Trump is assassinated by Liam Hemsworth. It sounds insane, but that's the scenario America faced 160 years ago when one of their most famous and beloved presidents was killed. Our story begins in the land of freedom, one evening in 1865. A young man has been sitting at the bar for an hour or so, nursing a bottle of whiskey. It's not an uncommon sight at Washington, D.C.'s bustling Star Saloon, but now it's time. He drains his drink and heads to the theatre next door. It's around 10 p.m. and the evening's performance is well underway, playing to a packed house. No one bats an eyelid as he walks in, and why would they? There's nothing unusual about a famous actor walking through a theatre lobby on show night. Everyone here knows him, from the ushers to the theatre owner. In fact, he's played on this stage, in this very theatre, many times before. But tonight, he's not here to act. Tonight, he's here to kill. Hello my friend, I'm Aslan Pahari and this is Assassins, the show where we tell the stories of history's most shocking assassinations. And today, it's a big one. The assassination of the president many Americans consider to be the GOAT. No, not JFK, the other one. Honest Abe, the great emancipator Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States. Now, you probably know that Lincoln was killed at Ford's Theatre while watching a play. But did you know that the assassin was a household name even before he pulled the trigger? Or that he went on the run for weeks after the assassination, hiding out in swamps and woodland? Today, we're bringing you the story of how the hunter became the hunted. Oh, and make sure to stick around until the end of today's episode for an absolutely wild conspiracy theory. But for now, back to the theatre. The assassin moves quietly through the dress circle, not wanting to draw attention to himself. He heads to the passageway just outside the presidential box, blocking accessways as he goes, doing whatever he can to make sure he won't be interrupted. There's now only a single door between the assassin and President Lincoln, sitting in his box, enjoying the play, oblivious to the danger lurking just outside. On this particular night, the president is remarkably unguarded. One bodyguard is doing a shift at the White House. Another is interstate on assignment. An extra guard, assigned to keep the president safe that night, isn't at the theatre either. He and the president's valet are drinking at the Star Saloon, the same establishment our assassin had been drinking at just moments earlier. In the end, it's almost too easy for the assassin to quietly slip into the presidential box. He knows this evening's performance well. So much so that he's timed his attack to coincide with a line that always gets a big laugh from the audience.
Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal. You sock-dologizing old man-trap.
What does that even mean? As the theatre erupts in laughter, the assassin draws his pistol and shoots the president from close range. The bullet enters Lincoln's head just behind the left ear, rips through his brain, and ends up lodged near the front of his skull. The president slumps in his chair before falling backwards. With gun smoke still hanging in the air, the assassin shouts, "Freedom!" and the nation would never be the same. Abraham Lincoln was president from 1861 until his assassination in April 1865, a tenure that almost exactly coincided with the duration of the American Civil War. The Civil War was fought between Union forces in the North and Confederate forces in the South. Initially, at least, the North didn't enter the war with the aim of abolishing slavery. They were fighting to keep the Union strong and, well, united. Almost like some United States of America. But as the war dragged on, it became obvious that slavery was the key issue being fought over. A few years into the war, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which effectively freed 3.5 million slaves. Marching through the South, the Union armies freed slaves as they went. By the time Lincoln was elected for a second term in March 1865, the Civil War was coming to a close, with the North victorious and slavery abolished. And in the crowd at Lincoln's second presidential inauguration was a famous stage actor, a handsome guy with angular features and jet black hair. At 26, he's recognized throughout the nation. His name is John Wilkes Booth. Wilkes Booth came from a family of famous actors. He was the second youngest of 10 children. With that many actors, they could have staged the Lord of the Rings trilogy in the family living room. John Wilkes Booth's English father, Junius Booth, had played in some of the finest theatres in London before relocating to North America. He encouraged his children onto the stage, and many of them seemed to inherit some of their father's talent. But it was Edwin, the eldest brother, who was the family's superstar. Edwin was hugely talented and one of the most famous American actors of the time. It's said that he revolutionized the way people performed Shakespeare. John Wilkes Booth and his other brother Junius were also famous actors, but Edwin was so talented and so famous that his younger brothers were destined to always play in his shadow. Now, before I continue, I want to make sure you got the Liam Hemsworth line at the start. Since Liam is the second most famous Hemsworth, him assassinating Donald Trump would basically be the same scenario as Wilkes Booth assassinating Lincoln. No shade to Liam Hemsworth. None of this should downplay Wilkes Booth's fame. A crowd favourite, he was known for hamming up his roles and playing to the audience. Some historians have reported that he was the first actor to have had his clothes torn off by fans. Not the last though. But there was another side to John Wilkes Booth. A political side. Wilkes Booth was a man with very clearly defined political views, and he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. He fiercely supported the Confederate cause and opposed the abolition of slavery. As the war dragged on, Wilkes Booth became more and more anti-Lincoln, to the point that in 1863 he was arrested for making treasonous remarks. Wilkes Booth was on a theatre tour at the time when someone overheard him wishing that the president and the whole damn government would go to hell. In the end, he was let off with a hefty fine and forced to swear allegiance to the Union. But this did nothing to subdue his anger. Throughout 1864, Wilkes Booth's unhealthy preoccupation with Lincoln got even more intense. 3 years into the Civil War, things weren't going well for the Confederate forces, with victory becoming increasingly unlikely. And with the 1864 presidential election fast approaching, Lincoln looked set to be re-elected on a platform that openly supported the abolition of slavery. John Wilkes Booth was furious and could often be found ranting about how Lincoln was trying to make himself a king. he decided something had to be done. But he didn't leap straight to assassination. At first, he was a little more reasonable. He just wanted to kidnap the president and hand him over to Confederate forces. His hope was that kidnapping might stir up anti-war sentiment in the North and swing favor to the South's cause. Like all good kidnapping heists, the first step was to assemble a crew. Wilkes Booth rounded up a collection of Confederate sympathizers to do the dirty work. And it wasn't long before they had an opportunity to pounce. Wilkes Booth had heard that Lincoln planned to go to the theatre one evening. What a play enthusiast this guy was. So Wilkes Booth arranged for his gang to wait on a quiet stretch of road where they could nab the president. Unfortunately for the kidnappers, Lincoln changed his plans at the last minute, foiling their plot. In spite of this setback, in the weeks leading up to Lincoln's assassination, Wilkes Booth got close to the president time and time again. As I mentioned earlier, Wilkes Booth was at the president's second inauguration. Even though he was still focused on kidnapping Lincoln at the time, he did later describe it as an excellent chance to kill the president. For a president, this guy's security seems pretty lazy. And then, in early April 1865, Lincoln gave an impromptu speech at the White House, telling his audience he was in favor of giving former slaves the vote. Once again, Wilkes Booth was there and was furious. He vowed that it would be Lincoln's last speech. A few days later, things got even worse for Wilkes Booth. Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union forces, effectively ending the South's chance to win the Civil War. The plan to kidnap the president was dead in the water. John Wilkes Booth decided that only one thing could work now. He'd have to kill the president. Wilkes Booth is now hell-bent on chaos, a last-ditch effort to unsettle the Union and free the South from Northern control. He goes back to the crew. Kidnapping is off. Assassination is on. The show is not called Kidnappers after all. And Wilkes Booth decides that it's not just Lincoln who has to die. He tells his crew that they need to kill the vice president and the Secretary of State at the same time. 3 men, 3 plots. In the end, though, it's only Wilkes Booth who gets his mark. The Secretary of State is stabbed, but not fatally. And the assassin assigned to kill the vice president can't go through with it and ends up drowning his sorrows in a bar instead. Always a better option than assassinating someone. Which brings us back to the presidential box at Ford's Theatre in Washington, D.C. John Wilkes Booth stands over the body of the president, gun smoke still hanging in the air. By the way, it was a surprisingly small pistol that shot the president. And you know what they say about small pistols? Big assassinations. Sitting alongside Lincoln had been his wife, Mary, and their guest for the evening, an army major and the major's fiancée. The major springs into action, grappling with Wilkes Booth, who, in the struggle, drops his pistol but manages to grab a dagger, stabbing the major in the left forearm. From there, Wilkes Booth leaps onto the stage, a more than 3-meter drop from the presidential box, falling awkwardly on his way down. The audience, unaware of what's happened, don't understand what's going on. Is well-known celebrity John Wilkes Booth leaping onto the stage just a part of the play? As Wilkes Booth staggers onto center stage, he lifts his bloody dagger above his head and shouts, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is Latin for "thus always to tyrants." The same phrase Brutus proclaimed after assassinating Caesar. It's a good line if you're an assassin with a theatrical bent. He then clears up any confusion the Latin may have caused with something in English. "The South is avenged, revenge for the South shall be free," or words to that effect. And then he runs. The major, who'd wrestled Booth in the presidential box, shouts, "Stop that man!" and some audience members set off in hot pursuit. Chaos erupts inside the theatre, and in the midst of it all, Wilkes Booth stabs the orchestra leader. The orchestra leader? This guy. Wilkes Booth makes his way to the side door of the theatre where a getaway horse is waiting. He flees into the night, heading south. Before long, he'd meet up with an accomplice, David Herold. The pair escapes south for a number of reasons. The countryside there is relatively uninhabited, largely covered by forests and swamps. And there's relatively little communication and transport infrastructure, like telegraph wires and railroads. More importantly, heading south increases their chances of running into people friendly to their cause and willing to help. Especially if Booth can, as planned, hop across the Maryland state border into Virginia. They continue south until dawn, before heading deep into the woods to hide out. As a new day breaks, co-conspirators bring them supplies, including newspapers, so that the fugitives can read for themselves the nation's reaction to Lincoln's assassination. And it's not at all what Wilkes Booth expects. Having just suffered through a long, bloody, brutal civil war, news of Lincoln's assassination is met by a wave of communal grief that sweeps across the United States. People on both sides of the war are angry at the actions of this impetuous Wilkes Booth. This is an actor, a celebrity. Many people have kept pictures of him on display in their homes. But as news of the assassination breaks, those pictures are ripped down, crumpled up, or even burned. Newspapers decry Wilkes Booth as a monster, a madman, a wretched fiend. Even in the South, where Wilkes Booth had assumed that the killing would be celebrated, he faces widespread criticism. His actions are seen as dangerous for the Confederacy, now sitting ducks for retaliation from the North fresh off their victory in the war. Wilkes Booth is stunned. He thought he'd be a hero in the South. A huge reward, the equivalent of millions of dollars in today's money, is put up for anyone with information leading to the arrest of Wilkes Booth or his co-conspirators. Union troops swarmed the woods and swamps of Maryland, closing in on Booth and Herold. For now, their only escape is to flee further south into Virginia. But first, they have to cross the mighty Potomac River, which, as it turns out, is easier said than done. Throughout the Civil War, the Potomac River had marked a border between Union forces to the north and Confederate forces to the south. If they can just cross the river, they'll be safe. Wilkes Booth is sure of it. Confederate sympathizers organize a boat for them to make the crossing, and on the night of April 21st, the fugitives push out into the cold waters. But the river crossing is more complicated than they'd anticipated. When they arrive on the opposite bank, they naturally assume they've done it. They've reached Virginia. They're in the South. But Herold, who'd spent much of his youth hunting up and down the banks of the Potomac, soon realizes that somehow they're still in Maryland. You guys had one job. It turns out that the pair had inadvertently rowed upstream, and given it was a particularly bendy bit of river, they'd landed back where they started, still in the north. There's nothing to do except lay low in the Maryland swamps before making a second attempt the following night. Second time's a charm, and by the break of dawn, they reach the South, connecting with more of Wilkes Booth's OG kidnapping crew. They secure a couple of horses and set off deeper into the state, eventually reaching a farm owned by Richard H. Garrett. News traveled slowly in those days, and no one at the Garrett Farm had heard about Lincoln's assassination. Wilkes Booth, no stranger to acting, assumes the role of an injured Confederate soldier returning home from the war, and he's offered food and a place to sleep. All the while, Union forces are hot on Booth's heel. After almost 2 weeks on the run, the fugitives' luck is running out. Around 30 men track Wilkes Booth and Herold to the Garrett Farm, arriving less than 48 hours after the fugitives. By the time the good guys turn up, Wilkes Booth and Herold are hiding out in the farm's tobacco barn. Herold knows the jig is up and surrenders immediately. But Wilkes Booth likes a bit of drama, and he digs his heels in. He shouts to the soldiers, "I prefer to come out and fight." At which point, they set the barn on fire. So much for a fight. The Union forces are under strict orders to take Booth alive. But in the confusion and flames, a soldier takes the opportunity to shoot, hitting him in the neck. The soldiers grab Wilkes Booth, dragging him from the burning barn to the farmhouse porch. Booth lies there, paralyzed. The bullet had ripped through his spine. This famous actor, once a favorite of theatergoers across the country, dies a slow death, eventually succumbing to his injuries 3 hours later. Wilkes Booth's body is wrapped in a blanket and unceremoniously hitched to the side of a wagon. It's taken to the USS Montauk and then onto the Washington Navy Yard where an autopsy is performed. They want to make sure they got their man, so more than 10 people who had known Wilkes Booth were brought in to identify the body. The corpse was identified by a number of distinctive features, including a scar on the back of his neck and a tattoo of his initials, JWB, on his left hand. It would be 4 years until Booth's remains were released to his family for a proper burial. But it would be a long time before the United States healed from the assassination of one of its most important leaders. Some might argue that it never did. Wait, you thought that was it? That we do an episode about the murder of an American president without a conspiracy? This is America we're talking about, the land of the conspiracy theory. In the case of the Lincoln assassination, conspiracy theorists ask, was the man killed at the Garrett Farm actually John Wilkes Booth? So, 42 years after Lincoln was assassinated, a book by a Memphis lawyer called Finis L. Bates was published, The Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth. In the book, it was argued that the man shot and killed at the farm was a John Wilkes Booth lookalike. Because they just happened to have one of those on hand. I know I wouldn't leave my house without my Aslan Pahari lookalike. You can never be too careful. Anyway, according to the conspiracy theory, the Wilkes Booth lookalike is shot at the farm, and the real Wilkes Booth escapes, living out his years in Texas. It's not until this real Wilkes Booth is on his deathbed that he makes a startling confession that he is the Lincoln assassin. And this is the conspiracy that keeps on giving, because, so the story goes, it turns out that after making his deathbed confession, he makes a full recovery and has to go on the run again. What do you call a deathbed when you don't die? It's just a bed, I guess. This time, he settles in Oklahoma, where he eventually kills himself. Unbelievable. Or maybe not. People across America eat up the story. In the 6 years after the book was published, it sells 70,000 copies, an absolute blockbuster at the time. The author even toured what he claimed was the mummified body of Wilkes Booth in carnival sideshows. You could actually do anything in those days, eh? There were a number of official, and so therefore far less juicy, counter-arguments. Like the sworn testimonies from people, including close family members who knew Booth and had identified the body. But my friend, you know how it is with a conspiracy theory. Once it's out, it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. And this one is the gift that keeps on giving, resurfacing every decade or so, or, in my experience, every other month on social media. Thank you for watching, my friend. If there's an assassination you'd like us to cover in the future, drop it in the comments.